to steal a quote from your podcast site, they are nuanced as right? So
oh yes, that's my brand.
There you go.
I have the whole merch line.
Welcome to UnityNow, the podcast where we discuss unity in the face of division. Inspired by the Unity 2020 plan, we strive to unite Americans by highlighting the middle ground between the two dominant parties and promoting the individual over groups. Each episode, we will bring you exciting, well-informed guests and host nuanced conversations about politically charged subjects. Our goal is to bring an end to the ideological war threatening the collective well-being of this great country.
Welcome back to the UnityNow podcast. I'm your host today, Toby Davis, and my guest today is Meghan Daum. Meghan is the author of 6 books, most recently The Problem with Everything, My Journey Through the New Culture Wars, which is a New York Times notable book for 2019, and her collection of original essays, The Unspeakable and Other Subjects of Discussion, won the 2015 Penn Center USA Award for Creative Nonfiction. She was a Los Angeles Times opinion columnist from 2005 to 2016. She's written for numerous magazines, including The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and Vogue. Meghan is the recipient of a 2015 Guggenheim Fellowship and a 2016 National Endowment for the Arts grant, and is on the adjunct faculty of the Writing Division at Columbia University School of Arts. She also teaches private workshops and personal essay and memoir out of her home in New York City. And perhaps most important, she was a clue on Jeopardy in 2021. Meghan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Toby. It's good to be here.
Yeah, great. We appreciate you taking the time. We know you're busy with your own podcast, the Unspeakable Podcast, and we'll get into that in a second. Tell us real quick about that clue on Jeopardy. I caught that on your one of your articles on Medium. How did that come about?
I'm not a regular Jeopardy watcher, and so somebody brought it to my attention. I was glad that I was in the middle. It wasn't the easiest clue, but nor was it not the most obscure. So it was a good place to be. And the person got it. The person actually got it. So that would have been embarrassing if they would be like, what? I have no idea. So that's
fantastic. That's now you've made it? Is that mic drop, walk off? You're
well, it's now? Funny actually. Well, it wasn't my name that was the clue. It was the name of my first book, which was My Misspent Youth. So, but I used to be a crossword puzzle clue a lot because Daum, my name, has a lot of vowels and it's a good crossword word. So that tend to happen sometimes. So that was great. Exciting.
Well, if you want, fill in our audience on anything I missed on your biography or anything we should know about you.
That was very thorough. That was fine. That was
yeah.
Good.
I'm gonna need a drink of water soon. That's a heck of a biography. You certainly have a lot of experience in writing, and another part of your biography, if I have this right, it says you were born in California and then raised primarily in the East Coast, a graduate of Vassar College and the MFA writing program at Columbia University School of Arts. And I'm curious, how would you describe your time in higher education? Was the faculty were they promoting kind of open exploration first and foremost? How would you grade them on that?
Well, I'm on the adjunct faculty of an MFA program, so I'm not in like a really hardcore academic setting. And the way it works at Columbia, it's a pretty big program. And part of the beauty of New York City is you have a lot of working writers kind of coming in and out of those programs and teaching here and there. So I haven't taught the last year or so. And when I do teach, I think students know what they're getting. It's funny, none of this was an issue until about 2015, 2016. I was just like a normal creative writing workshop instructor. And then suddenly stuff started to creep in around the edges. So I think that anyone who signs up for my class knows what they're getting. So I haven't had any problems, but nor do I have like some kind of tenure track full-time teaching job. I wouldn't want one. It's not something I have ever pursued. So I can't say that I would be unable to have one, but you never know.
Yeah. Well, good. How does the time now compare to your time as a student there?
Oh my gosh. When I was a student in that program in the early to mid 1990s, yeah, it felt very different. The whole point of writing anything, the whole point of any creative expression, but particularly for, say, nonfiction, for essay writing, that kind of thing, was to say something surprising and to push boundaries and to explore concepts in a way that they hadn't been explored before, kind of invite your reader to think about things a new way. And yeah, over the decades, that kind of mandate of being a creative person or a kind of, thinking person in the world has fallen away. So, the way I'm sure we're going to get into this conversation about the heterodox stuff, whatever you want to call it, but I really come at it from just a creative expression kind of place. So my students feel very stifled, and they're very afraid of their own ideas. And that was not my experience as a graduate student. So that's the concise answer to your question.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm very curious about your background and how, so I should have told you that up front, that I'm trying to go back pretty far, and I'm curious about your quote infamous move to Nebraska. So you started in New York, and then you went to Nebraska. Can you tell us about that?
So when I was 29, when I was almost 30, I moved from New York City to Lincoln, Nebraska for no particular reason. I was really broke. I was in a huge amount of debt, mostly student loan debt from going to Columbia, the very program in which I would later teach. And I was just kind of living this freelance writer girl life in Manhattan, and it was actually doing pretty well. I was freelancing a lot. I mean, I had been able to publish some things in the New Yorker, which is like a huge, huge deal. And I was by any measure successful, but I didn't have, I don't come from family money. Like, the dirty secret of being a creative person in a big city is that a lot of people have independent money and they're not actually making a living doing the arts. So I kind of missed the memo on that, and managed to get myself in a whole bunch of debt. So when I was 29, I just decided that I was going to take a sharp left turn in my life. And I had been to Nebraska on an assignment fairly recently. I had a magazine assignment, and I traveled there to do some reporting. Okay. And I always liked the prairie. I always had like a little house on the prairie thing. And I love that landscape. Actually, still really, I love that austere, big sky prairie landscape. So I moved there, and I started just doing my writing from there, and had quite an adventure. And I lived there for, I don't know, almost 4 years, actually.
Wow. So you didn't get the memo that those are flyover states either, right? So maybe you got lucky because did you drive there?
No, I didn't drive there. I didn't even have a car. Like, I lived in Manhattan, so I hadn't really driven regularly. No, I flew there on TWA. Remember that?
Yep.
And this was like 1999.
Okay. So
I was born in 1970. So the reason I have a long resume is because I'm old. That's really what it boils down to. But I flew there, and I bought a used car, and I rented a place, and then I ended up living out on a little farm, and wrote a novel that was inspired by the experience, and managed to get myself out of debt. So it all worked out, but I was very lucky that it worked out.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's, exploration is part of the writing process, I would assume. I'm not a writer, but, to be creative, you need to have experience sometimes.
Yeah. And I really knew, part of it too was that I felt that if I had stayed in New York, I was going to become the sort of provincial person that only a New Yorker is. I mean, New Yorkers are sort of the most provincial people in the world. If they grew up here, they live in the city. It's a very particular way of living. And if that's all you know, you're not going to really be a fully functional human being. So I was kind of noticing that in myself. And so I wanted to go someplace where I could just kind of learn to be an adult in a certain way. So I had to go to the provinces to become less provincial, which was kind of counterintuitive. But I ended up writing all about this in my novel. So I find all these things really interesting, demographic differences and regional differences and that kind of thing.
Thank you for tuning into the UnityNow podcast. We are a 100% volunteer organization dedicated to highlighting the sane middle ground between the two dominant parties and focusing on the individual over groups. If you've enjoyed this program, please consider supporting us through our Patreon. Links to our support page, as well as merchandise and full episodes, can be found at our website at UnityNowPodcast.com. We also invite you to join our Discord server, where you can interact with other listeners, contact our team, and connect to our merchandise page as well. Now, back to our show.
Yeah, it's fascinating in your background. So then you head out west from there, right? You ended up in Los Angeles?
I did. So I stayed in Nebraska, and then I knew I had to move on. But by that time, I had a big dog. And
St. Bernard?
No, I've had, he was a St. Bernard mix. I love big dogs, and I always have big dogs. This is the one way that one of the ways I make my life difficult is that I always have to have a big dog. So that was my first big dog, and I didn't want to move him back to New York, so kind of just kept going west. And yeah, I ended up basically settling in Los Angeles. I lived there for almost 14 years, and I still actually do consider that my home. I'm in New York these days, but I really like LA a lot. Wow.
And then, what did you find most surprising about the middle of the country? After you got off you weren't provincial anymore. So what did you find most surprising?
So many things. For one thing, again, we're talking about before social media. We're talking about before the digital age. So people listening to this are going to find this seeming quite
you had to talk to real people, maybe?
Yeah, so you would talk. So what I noticed was that because it was a relatively small community, there was this phenomenon where everybody would mix with everybody. So, there was kind of like, it's Lincoln. It wasn't like it was a tiny small town. It was a university. It was a state capital. It's a city. But certainly compared to a big city on the coast, there would be like a bar. People would go to hear music on a Friday afternoon, and there would be all kinds of people there. There would be lawyers and factory workers and local politicians and plumbers, and like everyone just kind of mixed together because they had to. They couldn't sort of go off into their silos. And so, when you live in a big city, it's very easy to only hang out with people exactly like you. And I'm embarrassed to say I was floored by this. I just was like, wow, all these kinds of like a working class person and a professional person, like they're all just hanging out together. So that was interesting to me. And really the biggest thing, and this was a theme in my novel, I kind of ginned up this idea, this concept having to do with the wide margin for error. So when I lived in New York, and I live in New York again, but when I was in my 20s, living in the city, I always had this feeling like the stakes were so high all the time that if you messed up, if you did one thing wrong, you're going to really mess up your life. Like even in high school, like if you go to the wrong college, if you take the wrong job out of college, if you date the wrong person, or, you move into the wrong apartment or something like that, like one little error could like completely throw you off and have serious ramifications because just everything's expensive and complicated and competitive. So when I got to Nebraska, I noticed that people would like kind of make decisions on a lark and maybe make mistakes, but it wouldn't really affect them too badly. Like they would marry young and have kids young and then divorce young and marry young again. And because housing was affordable and they could find a job, like they were living like perfectly okay lives, having made decisions that if you made that kind of decision in a place like New York City, you were probably going to be in big trouble. And so the analogy that always stayed with me was, when you take off on the plane at LaGuardia Airport or something in New York, it's a very short runway. One way off, if the pilot makes one little error, you're going to end up in Flushing Bay, like there's very no margin for error. So when you would land in Nebraska and Lincoln, it was like this huge space. And I always just thought, well, the plane could go that way, it could go that way. We're still going to get on the ground. So that became a kind of controlling metaphor in terms of my thinking when I lived there, and it was really useful because I had been a very kind of anxious, pent up, neurotic, sort of high achieving city person in a very cliched way, and I'm still those things, but I think that I'm much more aware that making mistakes isn't necessarily the end of the world. And you can actually live a much richer life. These people were actually living much more interesting lives because they were actually living their lives rather than being afraid of making of doing the wrong thing. And so I found that actually quite profound.
Yeah, that's interesting how the expectations are probably really different especially when you're going to college. If you think back to when you're in high school, a lot of us, had that expectation, you got to go to college. And we thought, well, if I can get through college, then I've really made it. Now life starts, right? I've got to the finish line. Now I can go, figure out what I'm going to do. But that's not realistic, even for kids in New York or LA.
I mean, it's not realistic if you're in the arts or if you're in a creative profession. I mean, certainly there are people getting out of, getting jobs in finance for huge salaries. So I think that's been the case. But, again, it's funny. I haven't talked about Nebraska in a really long time. And the whole cultural landscape, the whole world has changed so radically since then. I mean, it was 20 years ago that I think that somebody who's, out of college or, starting out is going to just have a different... I don't think somebody going from New York to Nebraska today would be quite as shocked. I don't think it would be that as different as it was then, because people in Nebraska are on Facebook and social media just like people in New York, and there's a people are siloed in different ways. So I'm glad that I did that before social media came along.
Well, absolutely, and I've talked about this on the podcast many times. I was in a Republican echo chamber before 2016 here in Indiana. And, I fell into the the Trumpism concept. And people have talked about how he kind of connected to the Midwest, and they felt a little bit, like they weren't being talked to with the left and even some people on the right. And, I fell into that and I voted Trump in 2016. And I've, since then kind of awoken to what happened and how he was a symptom and not the solution and all those things. And that's why we're here talking. But it's interesting. I felt that kind of concept back then is that, the people on the coast really don't look at the Midwest like we're part of America. And, and then we in turn kind of then flipped that around on them and said, well, they don't know what it's like here, and so they're not really part of this part of America either. So it's fascinating how you had. You probably didn't intend to. Well, you said it. You kind of intended to do that, right? You wanted to get a better mix of what the country was like, right?
Yeah. Although the funny thing was, I mean, Lincoln. It's a university town. It's very liberal there. So I ended up writing a novel that was in a lot of ways poking fun of. Midwestern lefties, because, especially in towns like that, they tend to be overly compensating with their what we now call virtue signaling. That term didn't exist back then, but there's an earnestness and a real need to show how progressive you are that comes out of a sense of overcompensation.
Yeah.
And so that was a kind of funny thing that I noticed there. So I ended up, I ended up poking fun at lefties a lot in Lincoln. So yeah.
Well, that's funny. I mean, and that goes to show that that America is not divided. It's not like you can split up the country by red and blue and left and right. It's like even your neighbor might be red or blue that you don't know about.
Right. I mean, there are pockets, of course. I mean,
tiny pockets.
In a university, small pockets.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's funny that you say that. It's like that. I wonder if this idea of these red states and the blue states, everything is so siloed now that it's worse than that. It's like there's the people who follow this sub culture and this subreddit, and it's gotten even worse. Like, would that we could go back to the red states versus the blue states, you know? It's so much more divided than that even now.
That's true. And you kind of touch on, in your book, The Problem with Everything, you touch on that a little bit about how, I'm spoiling the end of it maybe, but you talk about how the problem with everything is it's both bad and good, kind of, right? It's like what we're in now is helping us understand ourselves a little better. And but it's also, the culture wars are getting pretty bad. When you wrote that book, you talk about how you had to change the title of it, though, right?
The book had many iterations. I mean, initially it was going to be about feminism. It was going to be called, "You Are Not a Badass," because I was really tired of this kind of social media driven, in my opinion, performative feminism that was really just sort of about not only memes, but kind of framing the female experience as by default a victim-ish experience. And there was this kind of veneer of oppression over the whole female experience, which is actually, to my mind, the opposite of the truth. I mean, women have never been doing better. It's never been, women, there are no women freer and more empowered and with more agency than women in the United States in this moment. So, but, you know, even to say something like that would have been, you would be a heretic. So anyway, so I was interested in how we had gotten to this place with feminism. And so initially that was going to be about that. And then, but I also assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president. So, I mean, I was thinking about this stuff like in 2015, and I started the book, and then Trump was elected, and it was like, oh no. And I still sort of soldiered through and wrote a draft of the book about feminism. But by then, the culture wars were just so much beyond, you know, gender issues. There was just free speech issues and race and and just, you know, people's absolute derangement over Trump. And it was all this kind of really complicated kind of, it was just a really complicated kind of stew. And so I was trying to make sense of it. So yeah, for a while, I wanted to call the book Woke Me When It's Over. Yeah. I still think that would have been a much better title, but The Problem with Everything. Yeah, that title emerged from there's a section of the book that has to do with how I started watching like people talk to each other on YouTube, and, you know, what was for a while referred to as the intellectual dark web. And I got obsessed with like Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter talking to one another, and the Weinsteins and all that. So The Problem with Everything was a concept that arose out of that period of my life. But the problem with everything was really just writing the book, because writing that book was so arduous that it was, the problem with everything about my life was that I had to figure out how to write this book. So I'm very glad I'm no longer writing it. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I think you said, here's a quote, I think, if I've got this right. You said, "I've never been more afraid of writing a book, and I've never been more certain I had to." Yeah. Something like that. Yeah. And it's like, you're the second author in a row I've talked to now that said they had to change the title of a book. I talked to Eric Smith last week about Free Black Thought, and he talked about, it wasn't just changing the title. I think he rewrote most of it. So I'm curious, from a writer's perspective, do you think writing, you know, essays and books, novels, do you think the writing can keep up with the changes in our society now?
Not now. It's really, really hard. That's part of the reason I do a podcast now. I mean, I find it, I got really burned out on just writing opinion pieces. So, I mean, in addition to writing books, I've always been a journalist. I've always been an essayist. I was a opinion columnist for 10 years at the LA Times. And, you know, to have to come up with a take on a regular basis. Yeah. It's a tyranny, and it also results in something that I think is not talked about enough, which is that people end up just saying things for the sake of saying something. A lot of what everyone, you know, a lot of what people get so exercised over, if they're really mad about somebody's opinion, or like, how dare this person write an op-ed saying this terrible thing, it's because the person is a regular columnist and they had to file something that week. Sometimes they don't even really mean it. It's not like it's the opposite of what they mean, but I did this so many times. It's like, I kind of have an idea, but I got to write something, and so I'm going to kind of shoehorn this thing in here, and I'm going to say this, and it's not like it's wrong, but it's not what I would have said left to my own devices. And so we have this kind of really poisonous and just not useful ecosystem of opinion out there that's really not working. But to answer your question, I don't think everything is moving so quickly that you certainly can't write books that keep up with it. So I really the problem with everything, I decided to just really confine to my own thoughts about generational divides. I mean, really the book is about the culture wars seen through a generational lens, and how I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. And, especially, it talks about a lot of culture war issues, but the main one is women's issues, because, of course, as a white chick, that's all I'm allowed to write about in a critical way. But so, it talks a lot about that, and why is it that growing up in the 70s, I think girls had a lot of freedom that for some reason they feel that they don't as much now. And I was interested in looking at that. So I really, in order to make the book kind of stitched together, I just had to kind of decide that it was only about a couple of things. Like, there's no way you're not gonna like paint a canvas of the whole world. You got to just decide what your parameters are and stay within them.
Yeah, and it's like you talk about feminism a lot, at least in the introduction, and talk about how you have different concepts throughout the book. And it's like, did we already skid past where we needed to get to in feminism, or are we just talking so much about where we want to be in utopia that we're not talking about the actual nuanced problems we still might have? Do we still have some nuanced problems that we just can't talk about because we're trying to get to utopia?
Right. I mean, utopia is not going to happen. I mean, the utopia thing is so silly. It's like, why are we? Yeah, that would be great. A lot of things would be great that are never going to happen. So, if we're going to have a conversation and label it productive, let's take utopia off the table. Like, let's work with what we have. So yeah, I mean, Look, I mean, a lot of what's missing in the conversation about feminism is what's happened to men. I mean, men are in a crisis in a lot of corners of society, and that's never discussed. And that's actually partly a result of the strides that women have made. So it's good that women have made these strides, but there's some unintended consequences. And that is what's happened with men. There's less educational attainment, there's more depression, there's just less upward mobility. But it's frustrating because if you even start to talk about that kind of thing, you get tarred as a men's rights activist or some kind of anti-feminist defender of incels or something. And it's just, that's no. I don't even want to say it. Couldn't be further from the truth. I don't even want to dignify that response with a response, but unfortunately you do have to respond.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. I'm surprised that you would say that there were problems with men. Like you said, you're a white chick. You're not allowed to bring that up. I
know.
Yeah.
Well, white women are the new white men. That's the thing. So we white women are the new white men. We're the hated group now. We're Karens. So see, we've achieved total equality now, that we're hated and vilified just as much as men. Yes.
Yeah.
So the work is done.
Wow, should we? I hear some on your podcast. You're talking to people about, about problems that are not in the West, like people that are not from the West. They have a lot different problems than we do with feminism and women's rights and people of minorities and people with different religious backgrounds. Should we focus more on problems like that? North Korea, things that are really bad, or should we stop focusing on utopia and try to get back to the true nuanced problems in
I
America.
I would say the latter. I mean, it's not, it's not my job to complain about Islamic extremism and that's doing to women in Pakistan. I mean, that's their battle to fight. They would, that would be considered a kind of cultural imperialism to, for no reason whatsoever for us to sit around and obsess about women's rights in these other countries. I mean, I do think we have to be mindful of them. And I think for the sake of perspective, it's imperative that we know what's going on in these other countries and have some kind of reality check when it comes to complaining about our problems. Because it really, in my view, it hurts women for us to constantly, frame ourselves as victims. That makes absolutely no sense to me. It's unfeminist, and it's actually handing power to men that might not even have that power to begin with. Like, that's just, it never made any sense to me. But I get a lot of, I call myself a feminist. I mean, I don't disavow that word. I will use it. But to me, it means going through life knowing that you have the same rights as anyone else, and you have agency over yourself, and you're going to be accountable to yourself. And I think there are certain versions of feminism that seem to be not only not that, but the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, it's the whole equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome sort of argument, right? Do you think we've achieved true equality of opportunity for women in America?
I mean, I don't think we have equality of opportunity for people generally. But you can't. I mean, we can. This is the utopia thing. I mean, we can certainly try to do better. We can try to even the playing field, but you're never going to totally even it out. So, I mean, as women, look, I mean, women in the West, in the United States, they are entitled to education. I don't think there's a single thing that a girl can, that a boy can do growing up that a girl cannot do. There might be stigmas, there might be stereotypes, there might be battles to fight, but nobody is legally preventing anybody from doing anything. So in that sense, yeah, the playing field is even. Now, what's not even, and this is another thing that nobody talks about, is that you're not going to do anything about the fact that women are biologically the ones that have to gestate and lactate and drop out of the workforce for a period of time in order to raise small children. You can't socially engineer that away. And as long as that's a biological reality, you're going to have women making certain choices, maybe because they want to make those choices, or maybe because they feel they have to, dropping out of the workplace. There is a gender wage gap, but it's a motherhood penalty. Those are the kind of conversations that we should have if we want to talk about evening the playing field. But the problem is we can't have them because the minute you start making those noises, they're going to call you some kind of gender essentialist and an apologist for the patriarchy. And it's like, well, no, that's just biology. So, when you find a way to get around that, get back to me.
Well, for those of you watching on YouTube, this is probably where the video will get cut off because you just said that it's about biology. So, right? You're not allowed to say that. So,
oh, yeah. Okay. Well, sorry. You can bleep me out.
No, nobody watches this. It's okay. So, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. It is mostly about biology. And I think I first heard Eric Weinstein talk about how there are true ways society could help women get equal opportunities. And he talked about like a scenario with like a law firm, how, biology calls and a woman might leave the practice to start a family. And by the time she can come back, she is so far behind, there's no way to get back on a partner track or anything like that. And so, how could society make those kind of adjustments?
I really don't know.
What do you think? No,
I don't know. That's completely out of my wheelhouse. I've always worked from home. I've had very few jobs where I've gone into the office,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I know Eric has talked even about the notion of reparations for women. I find that a fascinating thing to talk about. I don't know what that would look like or even mean, but that's one of those things that I love, the idea of just even chewing on that. Like, what does that mean? it probably wouldn't work because reparations, depending on how you define them, don't really work. But I don't know. I mean, the thing is that even in countries where, there are in Scandinavia, where there's paternity leave and maternity leave and there's universal daycare, you still have women choosing jobs that are more in the humanities or tend to be lower paying. It's not like when given the choice, all these women will go into mechanical engineering. And so, there's a lot of brain scientists and people who've looked at why this is. And I find that fascinating. But again, if you go there, you will, you might never find your way back.
Well, you're just touting the erroneous claims of that misogynist Jordan Peterson when you talk about Scandinavia and their equal what they choose nursing versus. So is that, do you hear that when you talk about that from anyone?
No, I mean, I think most people give up on me. I think Jordan is really, I think he is really, I'm not, it's funny, if you even mention his name, I've written maybe a few pieces that have to do with him kind of tangentially, and immediately people think that you're some kind of, fangirl. If you even utter his name. So I'm pretty agnostic on Jordan Peterson. I don't think about him very often. I wouldn't go hear him speak necessarily. But I do think he has really interesting things to say about dominance hierarchies and nature and just, why things are the way they are. And I wish he were a little clearer about when he talks about them. I think he sometimes gets in his own way.
It's a problem I find with listening to, like Eric Weinstein as well. It's like, to steal a quote from your podcast site, they are nuanced as fuck, right? So.
Oh yes, that's my brand. There
you go.
I have a whole merch line.
Nuanced.
Yes.
And I was going to get to that in a second. But yeah, it's like they are so nuanced. They use so many different forms of phrases and words. It's like I think some people just lose track of what they're talking about.
Oh yeah, honestly. I'm not smart enough. I finally just decided I can't. The thing is that I've had arguments with people that I know, usually like young men in their 20s who love Jordan Peterson so much, and I'm finally like, you know what? I don't understand what he's saying, and they're like, well, I do. So I think, well, you must be a lot smarter than me because I don't follow it, and I kind of feel that way with Eric. I don't know. Either I'm not that smart, or there's something else happening, something is being lost in translation.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to your book, The Problem with Everything, real quick, you mentioned that as of 2019 might just be the year that cancel culture cancels itself. So we're now in the fall of 2021. How do you assess that now?
I think I was wrong about that. I think I was wrong about that. 2019, little did we know what was headed our way. So I do think that people, it used to be that everybody was fed up with this stuff, but they weren't talking about it, or they didn't even realize. They knew they were fed up with something, but they weren't really sure what it was. They couldn't pinpoint it. They could there was a visceral sensation of something happening in the culture that felt wrong, that felt disingenuous, that felt performative, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. And now I think people are mostly totally clear about what it is. And those who can speak up about it are doing so. And everybody's talking about it behind closed doors. The problem is that people won't speak up publicly because there's too much at stake, and we're still in a position, for God knows why, where you could lose your job for liking Dave Chappelle. So I don't I just don't know. We have to get away from that. That's not a sustainable social phenomenon. So but yeah, the cancel culture has not canceled itself, but I think people are starting to realize that they're not the only ones. In fact, they're in the vast majority. It's just this very small percentage of loud people who are holding the rest of the culture hostage. And boy, I can't wait. If I could live 100 years more, I would love to see what the kind of long view of this is. I don't know why this has happened. I really don't.
Yeah, I think I would argue that I think it might have canceled itself. Like, in a way, it's because it's swallowing people that are now minority groups. Women, black people.
The circular firing squad. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nobody's safe now. It doesn't matter. Like you just said, Dave Chappelle, maybe in 2019. I don't know exactly when, but he would be safe. But at some point he was safe because of the color of his skin. At least he was in the right tribe. But now anyone can be canceled because they didn't follow the woke culture. There was a way you put it. You've coined a couple phrases. He wasn't a member anymore of the woke-ascenti.
Oh, the woke. Yes, I should have called it the woke-nascenti, but there's like the cognoscenti.
Yep.
The cognoscenti of wokes. Yes.
Yeah.
Or sometimes people say the wokerati. I've heard that too.
The wokerati.
But I like woke-ascenti. Yeah.
Yeah, and I parse that together with Eric Weinstein's Wokistan versus Magistan. So the Wokisenti or the Wokerati live in Wokistan, right? And they kicked Dave Chappelle out. Yeah,
I know. It's like a Dr. Seuss book or something.
Right.
It's like the wokes of Wokistan. Oh, they were all sleeping. It was a quiet night. They were sleeping. The wokes of Wokeville.
We don't like it when we laugh at him, so we better get serious. So.
Oh, I love Eric. I would say this to his face.
No, I mean the woke.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, right.
I
mean, but that's interesting. But you were saying that you thought that cancel culture had canceled itself. I guess to me, cancel culture canceling itself would mean that it goes away. But I guess I see what you're saying. It's worse than ever. I mean, the other thing too is you can only be canceled by your own side. So this is why liberals are so silly. They have no strategy because they keep doing this. And all they're doing is canceling themselves, like
swallowing their young. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, it's if a liberal person says something and Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson are saying mean things about them, that's not being canceled. That's adding to your cultural currency. Like you want that. So what the devastation is when you get canceled by your own tribe. So, but you get hoisted on your own petard. So, but it's kind of delicious to see. But that's why I have no. It's always best to try to have no tribe. That's the safest place is no tribe, I think.
You should try to get Michael Malice on your podcast. I was just watching him on Joe Rogan today. He would love when you say it's delicious to watch, because he's a professional internet troll.
Yeah, I know. The Schadenfreude is, but it's hard because that's the other thing is I try not to dwell in that. It's a guilty pleasure, but there's no nourishment in it. We can talk about this in a bit, but I mean, my podcast, I try not to dwell in these things. I try to just, instead of complaining that we can't have the conversation, I just want to have the conversation and move forward.
Right.
But it's hard because people really, really like to watch sanctimonious people get completely trampled by their own sanctimony coming back at them.
Well, I mean, you kind of answered my first question about the podcast. So the podcast is called the Unspeakable Podcast. And I was going to ask, were you at all afraid that writing has become too slow of a pace to get your thoughts out? And you already answered that. You said potentially. So what are some of the things you think are unspeakable that you try to bring up on your show? Well,
so the show really, there's, my approach is that I want to talk about subjects that have been labeled unspeakable or rendered taboo, not because in and of themselves they are unspeakable, but because they haven't been spoken about in the right way. So I don't think anything is taboo if you find the right person to talk about the right topic. And there's real nuance there. I mean, nuance, again, is now a word that's been completely weaponized, and it doesn't mean anything anymore. But to me, the art of the show and the most fun part is thinking like, okay, what do I want to talk about? What's the thing I really want to get at? And then going out and finding the right person to talk about it. And it's often somebody who we don't know of, who we haven't, who's not well known. I did an episode about incels recently, involuntary celibates. It's this subculture of, young men who think that they can't get a woman, so they engage in all this kind of misogynist stuff online. And for various reasons, the media has kind of framed them as a hate group or even a terrorist organization. And it's a total media manipulation. It's not really true. And I thought that the incel phenomenon also spoke to a lot of the stuff that I was talking about a little bit ago, with men just, a certain kind of man just feeling like he doesn't have any resources anymore or any agency. And so this misogyny emerges because these men are so powerless. Anyway, I thought there were a lot of dimensions to this.
Yeah.
And I had wanted to do an incel conversation for a long time. And it was actually one of my listeners who suggested Nama Cates, who has a podcast called Incel. And she does a lot of reporting, and she talks to these guys, and she looks at it from all different angles. And so I was thrilled. And it's not like I had announced that I wanted to do a show about incels. But one of my listeners is so finely tuned into the show, she suggested Nama. So I brought her in, and that was like a perfect example of how I want to do the show. This is something that nobody really talks about because it's very hard to get right. And I thought we got it pretty close to right. I mean, you could always, nothing's ever perfect, and you only have limited time. But I love that. So, yeah, I mean, nothing is unspeakable if you do it right, I think.
Yeah.
But most people don't. That's the problem.
Do you think the only way to talk about subjects like that is through with a long form sort of podcast?
Yeah,
like CNN's not going to do it in a 10-minute segment.
No. And I wonder too, like, is writing about it. I cut my teeth as a journalist, as a writer, writing about this kind of thing, and taking subjects that were complicated and really, really digging down into them, and kind of using my own experience as a lens through which to look at things. And it worked for a while. I was a controversial writer in my 20s and 30s, but not gratuitously provocative. I thought I was very thoughtful. I was careful. And I had editors that saved me from myself. I had really smart editors, and I had long form. I could write in print. I could publish a piece in the New Yorker that was 5,000 words. And there were not comments. There was not a comment section. People would read the piece, and if they were upset by it, they would have to sit there and think about why they were upset by it, and they would have to get a letter and write a letter to the editor and put it in an envelope and find a stamp and put it in the mailbox, and maybe it would be published in 6 weeks, and it probably wouldn't be, and I would be on to the next piece. So the metabolism was just so much slower, and you could express, you could chew on complicated ideas in print at that time. And I'm not saying you can't now, but it's very, very hard. The editing resources just aren't there, and people's attention spans aren't there. And so for me now anyway, I find the conversational format more satisfying. And that's not to say I'm still writing. It's not to say I'm not going to write again, but for just whatever reason, I think this is the way to do it. And they do have to be long. I don't know. Do you have people complain to you that your show is too long? I've had some people say like, "Oh, it's good you're doing a podcast, but just a little tip. You might want to make the episodes a little shorter." And I just think like, you know nothing of my work. Like, no, I've never had anybody complain that the show is too long, actually.
Yeah, we've had some of those conversations, even internally amongst our team. As you might know, we're an all-volunteer team that, we have normal day jobs, most of us, and we come together remotely to kind of produce this. And we've had discussions about what's the best timeline for a podcast. I'm a pretty avid Joe Rogan listener.
Okay.
And so I tell them, like, I'm not trying to go 3 hours. It's like nobody knows Toby. Nobody's going to tune into the Toby Davis podcast for, 3 hours. But, it's also you have to have a little more time than maybe 20 to 30 minutes, like you said, to get through a topic, to expose certain things. And that's where I think you and I are both using the word nuance the right way. And we're not stealing that word, for something else. And I think that was a great analogy you said you mentioned a second ago, where you said the metabolism was slower on that form of writing. And it's just like, food, junk food, where the metabolism is quick and your body burns that for energy quickly, whether it's high in sugar, whatever it is really bad for you, versus, slower metabolism. And I think you even mentioned this in the book. It's like, the society now is, we have this culture where we can, especially with social media, have a half-baked thought, throw it right out. And, that's not really how you're meant to interact with people. You're meant to interact in this way where the two of us had something we just clarified a second ago. And we were able to do that because we're sitting here one-on-one talking to each other with slower metabolism, with more nuance.
Yeah. Yeah. And also I've never thought about this before, but I think too, if you can kind of have a conversation that builds to something, the listener kind of gets to know the guest in an organic way. Like, it's not, you don't start the interview with the most controversial thing that guest is going to say. You don't go out of the gate just really hot. You have, you kind of warm up and they get to know the person and they get used to that person's voice. And then it's like, they trust. It's like, in writing, we always talk about this. You have to trust the narrator. You have to be kind of, if especially you're writing first person narrative nonfiction, you always need to be a little bit in love with the voice of the narrator. So I think in a podcast, the listener gets used to the guest and they get comfortable with the guest and they start to kind of like the person, or at least not be put off by them or uncomfortable by them. And then when the guest starts saying something that's a little weird or a little new or a little uncomfortable, it goes down easier.
That's true. It's 1 degree of separation. It's like you're not sitting there with them necessarily, but you kind of are. You're like sitting, it's almost like a campfire where you just kind of snuck in, which I think is why Clubhouse specifically has a lot of good effects on people. And, it's like you get to sit.
Other than not sleeping. I don't know about that.
Well, it's like, that's why Twitter and everybody went to Twitter Spaces and all these different things, because you could actually have an audio sort of nuanced conversation with even a bunch of different people at the same time. But a podcast, you get to listen in on maybe 2 people having a long form conversation. And like you said, that's a great way to put it. You get to trust the person, even if you didn't know them, or even if you thought you didn't like them beforehand.
Right. Yes. That happens a lot, actually. I had Brett Stevens on my podcast, the conservative New York Times columnist. And I had so many people saying, "Oh my gosh, I thought I hated that guy," but he was really likable. I think he's very personable. I had enjoyed him on other podcasts, so I was not surprised that I enjoyed him. But I was gratified to hear that people they said, well, even if I don't agree with him on a lot of stuff, I can see that he's like a nice man, like he's a good person. And
That's
he's
great.
Open-minded and congenial, and I enjoyed being in the company of you two for however long. And that's great,
Yeah, I think I need to do that with your Chelsea Handler episode, because she's somebody I'm not supposed to agree with, so I need to listen to that and hear her out and hear what you talked to her about.
Yeah,
and
that one was a little bit different.
Was it?
Yeah, it was a little bit different. Yeah. She actually called back. We kind of got into it. But again, you have to warm up to it. It started off as a normal interview, chit chat, and then we kind of got into some arguments or just kind of a little heated discussion. And then it was great. She said afterwards, I hung up and I realized what I meant to say was this. And so we did another call the next morning. She called back and we kind of continued the conversation a little bit. So that was nice.
Well, that's good. Did you record it for part 2?
Yeah. No, that was this. Yeah, that was part of
that's part of
the podcast.
Good.
Yeah.
Great. And you've had a lot of great guests like Carla Power, Dr. Laura Edwards Leeper, and Lisa Selvin Davis, Dr. Drew, Heather Hying, and Brett Weinstein.
Dr. Drew twice has been on. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And Sam Harris. I mean, that's quite a list there. So, but that's great that you're trying to tackle those subjects. Why do you think those subjects are unspeakable to begin with? Why are they taboo?
Because they require saying things. Well, look, I mean, they require holding opposing ideas in your head at the same time. I mean, it's pretty simple, actually. And they require kind of separating what you want the world to be from the way the world is, and recognizing that just because you don't expect the world to change in the way that you would like it to doesn't mean that you're not a good person. I mean, these are so basic, but for some reason, we seem to be in a moment where if you try to work with the materials you have, somehow you're part of the problem or something. I don't know. I wonder what you think about that. It's like,
well, part of me always feels like we're creating our own little echo chambers and our own little bubble in the podcast space, especially.
Yes.
So the people I just listed, most of our audience probably knows most of them. So I always think, how do I reach the people just outside the bubble? How do we get them to listen to a podcast if they're used to getting their news and, what's going on from Twitter or from CNN or MSNBC, which I found fascinating. Like I said, I was listening to Rogan today with Michael Malice, and Malice corrected him when he said that CNN or whoever was mainstream media. He said, no, you're mainstream media. And he said, yeah, you're right, by about a factor of 10. It's like there's so many more people out listening to these podcasts, yet still we have to fight back against the extremism, both left and right. How do we reach those people that are still stuck on the outside of the bubble?
I know. Yeah, I know. I mean, but it is amazing. Like, somebody can have, I mean, even with like Brett and Heather, they have millions of listeners, I suppose, and are gods in a certain universe. And yet I've had conversations with so many people in publishing and Hollywood, wherever, and they have no idea who these guys are.
Right. It's like you have these, it's almost like the people that live in North Korea. It's like they don't know that America is what it is. They don't know the internet exists. They don't know when time actually began, and we have these silos in America like that where people just don't know. It's like I had Desh Amila on about the Better Left Unsaid film, and it's a film he produced and Kurt Jaimungal wrote and directed. And I asked him to say, like I said, what would you say to the people you're trying to reach with the film? And he said something like, imagine that there's a world that you don't know exists. And imagine there are things going on in the country that you don't know about. And, this is a way to click a button to open, kind of the window shade and see those things. Mm-hmm. And it's like, do we, as a point, do we want to expose them, or do we want to remain in our silos where I get my news from breaking points with, Sagar and Crystal, and somebody else can go ahead and still get their news from MSNBC or CNN?
Yeah, I mean, and then we get into this question of like, we don't have an agreed upon set of facts.
Right.
So that's really the ultimate problem. I don't know. I'm not, I'm both optimistic and despairing, actually, in this moment. I mean, I'm heartened to see so many people recognizing where their frustration is coming from and pushing back, but I don't really see like a business model that's workable. You've got a lot of people operating in their own little silos. We keep using that word. And the thing is, it's working for some people. It's enough of a winner take all situation that I think it would be hard to, I'm sure people say to you this all the time, well, somebody should just make a media company and it should have, you and Barry Weiss and Matt Taibbi, and they go through these list of names. And a lot of those people are doing so well on their own that there's no incentive for them to do something like that. So we need to kind of figure out how to go from here. I really don't know. So I'm not, I'm just a humble writer. I am not a business person. So I cannot be I'm not going to take the blame for not being able to figure that out.
Well, you're not just a humble writer. You're a well-spoken, very intelligent writer with very very balanced experiences. It's like, that's not, I don't know if, do you think Barry Weiss has ever been in Nebraska?
Yeah, I'm sure she has.
You think so?
Yeah. She's from Pittsburgh.
That's true.
She's from Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is very
maybe
very
that's
Midwestern.
the formula, I mean, maybe that's what you need. You need all right, to be a writer in America, you now have to travel and see more than 5 states or something like that.
Yeah. And you've got a lot of people. I mean, that's a whole other thing. You'll have a lot of people writing opinion journalism and not being paid anything for it. I mean, there's just a lot of junk food out there. The creative economy is such that it's reporting is expensive, so there's less of it. Opinions are cheap, so there's more of it. And you've got young people trying to turn out 3-4 hot takes a day so they can make enough money to, pay the rent at the end of the month, doing that 4 times a day, every day. It's terrible. It's really, I don't know. I don't know how we're going to get out of this. That's one reason I'm glad that I don't like getting older, but I am kind of glad that I'm old sometimes because I'm very lucky that I kind of came of age when I did.
Yeah. And now you know what you don't know, what you thought you knew everything like I did. I don't know. But now
no, I know nothing. Yes.
Exactly.
Ask a teenager if you want to know everything.
Don't do that. I have a 15-year-old and he's as dumb as I was when I was 15 for sure. So
does he admit that, or do you have to?
He's starting to, but he still has pockets where he, forgets that part and then goes on to tell me something that's so dumb that it's like, please stay off social media until you're 30, So
you probably don't even know the social media that he's using. He's like, stay off of Facebook, young man.
Right.
They have no interest in that.
Right. No. We have an app. I'm a techie, so there's an app that controls what apps he can have on his phone. So unless he's got a burner phone, then we're okay for now. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So what we'll do for these folks is tell them to go listen to the Unspeakable podcast, and that'll save their life. How about that?
Well, if you tell them, then they won't do it. Of course, you have to tell them not to listen.
Tell them not to. It is the most defamatory, cringeworthy stuff you've ever. listened to.
I decided I was going to coin a neologism recently. So there's a phenomenon where if you have a really unspeakable topic, the podcast has a lot of downloads, but no comments. Have you noticed this?
Yeah.
Like a lot, like very high downloads, but nobody will dare comment on it or admit that they're listening to it. So I like to call that a download, L-O, like on the down low.
Yeah.
It's a download on the down low.
Download.
Yes.
Yeah, with an apostrophe. Yeah.
Yes. So I had that recently on, I did a series about some gender stuff, and that stuff always gets a lot of listens and no comments.
Yeah, we did. I did a debate with 2 Braver Angels members from Virginia, and one was, they frame everything from left and right, red or blue, and their debate was on abortion. And I did my best to kind of stay the hell out of the way and let them just discuss it. There's plenty of views on that on YouTube. I don't know how many listens on the audio, but you're right, 0 comments.
Oh, wow.
Nobody wants to weigh in on that one.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, then you're doing something right. We don't want comments anyway.
We just don't know about it.
Comments ruin the world.
Yeah, that's true. You can't have nuance. And you want to be, hold it up again, the mug. We want you to be.
Yes. Yeah. Nuanced AF. So yeah,
Yes.
you can buy their hats, mugs. If you have a podcast, it's all about the merch, apparently. Do you have merch yet?
We're working on it. Yeah, that's the next step.
You made it when you're actually chasing down people's delayed merch orders. Like I personally spent 2 hours doing that. So I'm really glad that
we can't wait.
I got so far in my career that here I am. Yes.
Chasing down merch. Yeah. All right. Well, what else are you working on? Do you want to tell our audience that's made it this far that what you have coming up next on your podcast, or any guests you want to highlight?
Well, depending on when this airs.
That's a good point.
I just did I did something I'd never done before. I did 3 episodes in 1 week, and this actually speaks to this nuance question because I've done a handful of episodes on this gender stuff. I mean, this is hugely in the air. This is one of those issues that I think in terms of kids identifying as non-binary and this transgender movement, all this stuff. This is one of these issues that I think is discussed so poorly. It is both over-discussed and under-discussed, and it's considered absolutely radioactive. Even some of the smartest, boldest people I know won't touch it. And I think that's because the right people have not yet been found to talk about it enough. You have a lot of people talking about it in a kind of lazy, sloppy way. And myself included. So I was a little bit guilty of this because early on I did a show with a therapist who deals with gender dysphoric teenagers, and she was excellent. Her name was Sasha Ayad. I thought it was a terrific episode. And interestingly, I got no pushback. Again, see, they say, how can you possibly do this? Aren't you going to get killed on Twitter? No, I think anybody who's going to complain about that is just being completely disingenuous, because she was absolutely, I thought, just perfect the way she talked about this. Did not throw anybody under the bus. So I did that. And then, people would say, well, do another thing like that. And I did a couple episodes that I thought were good, but not telling the whole story. And I realized that if I was going to tackle this issue, the only way to do it was to have 3 different episodes in 1 week.
Oh, wow.
And so I did that. And in one case, I'd had a couple of moms who had approached me to come on the show who had sons who were claiming transgender identities, and they were pretty sure that the sons were on the autism spectrum. I mean, they were pretty sure that their kids were not transgender. So I'd had them on, and it was a good conversation, but it didn't tell the whole story. And I felt like if I was going to really be thorough in my job, I needed to do more. So I talked to another therapist, and then I brought that therapist together with the moms, and we did a second show on the Wednesday. So I had the therapist on a Monday, the moms with the therapist on Wednesday. And then on Friday, I had Lisa Selin Davis, who you mentioned at the top, who's a journalist who writes about this stuff so exquisitely and so rigorously, and is not published enough, I think, because she is so nuanced and deals with so much complexity. Like, if you want to bash the trans people, you're not going to get it from her. And if you want to prop up this movement in a shallow way, you're certainly not going to get that from her either. So she kind of makes nobody happy, and that's the only way to actually do this right. So I had her on, and I thought it was an excellent discussion. But I had to do it I had to do three episodes in 1 week, because I thought that if I spaced them out too much, people were going to hear one little part, and then it wasn't going to be enough. So it's we talk about how we can only get this done if we have 2-hour-long podcasts or whatever, but in this case it was 6 hours, and it's still not enough. I still feel like there's more to say. I don't want to become the gender show at all. I kind of want to say my piece, or at least feel that I covered this as best I can, and then never talk about it again. But so it was interesting to do that. And I don't go looking for trouble. I don't go Googling my name or anything like that. So I'm sure some people complained, but nothing that I saw. And I certainly had a lot of people telling me privately that they really appreciated the discussions. So that's something relatively new.
And that shows a willingness to learn and to update what so you thought you wanted to get back to it and learn a little more. And that's what I keep learning new things when I speak to guests. And that's the great thing that, it's a little selfish, but that's the job. Yeah. That's not why I do it, but
that's being a journalist.
Yeah. I try to, absorb what I can, and it's really great. It's we didn't, we're in this space where we know people like Brett and Heather, but I'd never heard of you. We had not heard of the Unspeakable Podcast. So we were in those tiny little bubbles, and we interviewed Heather Shane Blakesley of Root Quarterly, and we ended up on her little round table, and I noticed you in the audience on the Zoom call.
Oh, with Eric. Yeah, that's right. Oh, that was a great, yes, I was listening in on that. Yeah.
And I said, well, what's that? Who's that? Because I think Heather even mentioned that you were there, and thanked you for being there. So that's the whole reason. So I learned a little bit, and I found, you. And now I have a 3-part series. I think that's what you called it, right? A 3-part series, this discussion for your podcast about gender dysphoria.
You're doing it. So you're doing a 3-parter.
No. Oh. I was just saying, now I have that to listen to.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. We're recording this for everyone's perspective. We're recording this on October 19th. I think you said you even took a week off after.
I did take a week off because I realized that if I put another episode up, people weren't going to be able to catch up. So I wanted people to absorb that. But yeah, it's so funny. Heather Heying was the very first guest on my podcast.
I noticed that. Yeah. And that's great. I want to listen to that too, because I think you mentioned in your show description that we don't hear much about her background before, like the Evergreen Institute.
She was a very serious musician.
Yeah.
She's a very serious classical pianist. And her mother ran a calligraphy school.
Oh, wow. There's something that we talk about cursive not being in schools.
Cursive, yes.
But calligraphy, that's a whole nother ballgame.
Yes, I'm sure there's an evolutionary explanation.
I'm sure, yeah. Well, we'll send the audience there. We're now over an hour. We're not quite to 3 hours, but we're well over an hour.
Okay.
So we'll send everybody to, Twitter. It's Meghan_Daum, and then MeghanDaum.com.
Yes. Right? Yeah, and it's Megan with an H. And they can find the show. The show is The Unspeakable. It has its own website, theunspeakablepodcast.com. Uh-huh. And it's on all the regular places you can find your podcasts. And I have Carla Power on this week talking about radical Islamic extremism and de-radicalization, and amazing conversation. People are talking about, it's always the same, people, social media, the Islamic State is actually using Tumblr accounts to lure ordinary Muslims into becoming radical violent extremists. It's the same process. Your life is lacking meaning. Go join this terrorist organization. It's like, wow, it all just comes down to people's need for affiliation and belonging. I think it's always that.
That goes to the cancel culture narrative. The right always throws shade at Twitter for canceling Republican accounts or conservative people, but then the Ayatollah Khomeini still has a Twitter account and can recruit people and things like that. So that's you said it was a Tumblr account.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting conversation with Carla. And she's a great journalist, and she's covered the Middle East for a long time. And she's an American. She's American who's from St. Louis actually, but grew up partly in the Mideast and knows a lot about the region. So that's a great conversation. And I'm gonna have a fun one coming up with some actors, some comedian. They have a show called Bitter Homes and Gardens on YouTube, and one of them is an old friend of mine. So we're gonna be talking about that. That's gonna be kind of a fun show. So try to mix it up.
Fantastic. Well, that seems like it's a little lighter, right? In
yes.
unspeakable terms, but the Islamic extremism was.
Yeah, we're gonna go from Islamic extremism. And then there'll be I'm not sure the order, but we're gonna have all kinds of different things. Yeah, and I had Dr. Drew and his daughter, Dr. Drew Pinsky and his daughter Paulina Pinsky, because they wrote a book together, so they came on, and she was my student.
Oh, really?
Yes,
that's fantastic.
She was my student, my private workshop.
She's pretty liberal and disagrees with him on a lot of things.
She's super woke. I know.
Heard, right?
Yes, yeah. She's very social justice. But I adore her. She's so open-minded and funny, and they're great together, and she's delightful. So that was a really fun episode.
Yeah, that's great. All right, we'll send everybody there. The Unspeakable Podcast. I think episodes drop weekly. Say Sunday at 9 p.m.
Yeah, they usually come out.
Eastern.
They're Sunday. Yeah, usually. They're supposed to drop Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern time, but they'll be there Monday morning.
Okay,
definitely
fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, Megan, we appreciate your time so much. We know you're busy and have a podcast to film. It's been great. Maybe you can join us again at some point, and we can get to our 3-hour episode and talk more about what has been unspeakable since now. I'm sure there's going to be plenty to talk about.
Yeah,
so.
I'm sure plenty. Well, thanks for having me, Toby. It was really fun.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Meghan Daum. That's the Unspeakable Podcast. And thanks, everyone. We'll see you. And good night.
Thank you for watching the UnityNow podcast. We'll be back with another conversation that highlights the political middle ground to unite Americans and end the ideological war. In the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. Please comment below and hit that subscribe button.